year summer, and I graduated in December.
What about you, bro?
I graduate next year.
After
the
4 years.
Yeah.
All right.
I was just doing politics like a fucking nerd.
Well, they really put you over and like,
Bro, Billy wrecks me every fucking time.
Well,
Equal 100 3 times. I'm taking equal 200 for the second.
Well, I can't talk to a big guy and he can't make it in 5 minutes without complaining about Bailey, bro.
I mean, I didn't bring him up.
Yeah, but I knew you were going to say it, like, let's get out of the way.
You have to play Saudis and Audis every time you get in your car or what?
Oh, for the shit. It's a terrible song.
Yeah, it is.
I played it one time.
You have to once. You go to White House movie, bro. Like, you got it.
I actually love it, man. Like, I don't want to change it. I want to leave it like that.
Time to wrap it again.
Sorry?
Time to wrap it.
You guys know, volunteering services for sustainability. Yeah. So we're still looking for volunteer note takers for this class. I mean, I'm sure you all know what it is. I'm just gonna say it again, just in case. So it's basically, you take your notes, like you always do, computer, tablet, or like by hand. At the end of the day, like within 20 hours of your lesson, tutorial or lecture, you submit it to the database, and somebody that can't come to class for disability reasons can actually use the notes. It's an incredibly useful services for people that actually need it, and in exchange, you get, CCR credit. And it's really one of the easiest ways to get it. The only thing you need to do is take notes, upload them. It actually helps you get better notes because it's kind of, you're kind of conscious that somebody else is going to use them. It really helps them. It's one of the easiest ways to do it if you haven't gotten CCR credit. That's pretty much it. It's just really easy, and we still need people in this class. Would anybody be interested? Thanks. Just those two.
If I'm not mistaken, you get a kind of a certificate for doing so at the end of the process as well.
Well, you get CCR credit, and if you need so, accessibility services does provide with a recommendation letter, like saying this person was useful. So we just do this. You need a pen?
Wait till you hear my intro. That should better.
Yeah.
It's gonna hold me one.
What's the charging one?
Right here. It's a big break, so I won't break it always.
Is it touchscreen?
No. That was my razor. Still good brush it. I know, but like it's 1200 USD, like I got better.
Get it fixed third party. Get fixed third party.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I went for the repair store here, and they're known as like
You would get fixed
it was pretty good. They said I think like 500 or something. Much better.
That's so good. 500 Canadian versus 1200. Because the warranty
But then
on
there's a
stuff.
risk if they fix it.
They give you warranty, right? It's a legit stuff. So what do you always think? Doesn't it like it's faster?
less likely if you have it in the back of your mind already that it's going to be read by somebody else. Before I begin today's lecture, let me see if there's any quick questions or comments about anything that I covered last class. If not, I just wanted to draw to your attention that the library course reserve system sometimes is a little bit slow getting off the start at the beginning of terms in terms of getting readings up. They will hopefully have them all up relatively shortly. In the interim, I have posted the Charles Tilley article on the Corpus site, and we'll continue to do that over the next couple of weeks to make sure that you have the readings available to you when you need them, rather than wait for the library to get their act together. But hopefully they will have their act together relatively soon before you can access it through their system. But in any event, we will make those readings available to you. And I would have made put the Charles Tilley article up much earlier, had I been aware that it wasn't yet up in the library course reserve system. So my apologies for only getting that up for you yesterday. Last class, we began to talk about comparative foreign policy as a field of study. And I tried as an introduction to highlight some of the complications in studying comparative foreign policy. In particular, by highlighting the fact that comparative foreign policy sort of straddles the subdivisions within political science that are usually referred to as international relations on the one hand, and comparative politics on the other. And tried to highlight the extent to which that straddling of those two subfields brings with it some complications. Some complications in particular in conceptual terms. And in that context, one of the things that I tried to highlight last class is that one of the core concepts, of course, of political science is the concept of politics. And that even in that area, there were substantial disagreements in terms of exactly how to understand politics. With those coming out of the liberal and pluralist tradition that tends to dominate the study of comparative politics, understanding politics primarily as a competition over who gets what, when, where, and how within a political community. In other words, politics is largely understood as taking place within a political community, and the arena within which politics takes place is to a large extent legislatures. Obviously, that changes in different political systems. So those in which legislatures do not exist, authoritarian systems, obviously function somewhat differently from Western liberal democracies. But that is a rather minor exception insofar as that even authoritarian regimes around the world generally find it necessary to have some kind of elected representatives within their systems that simply don't have a lot of power. Not wanting to reiterate yet last week's lecture, the other interpretation of politics that tends to dominate or tends to be more influential in the field of international relations sees politics as first and foremost the confrontation between different political systems, between different states. As Carl Schmitt put it, the problem of us versus the other. He argued that the chief political function of any state, above all else, is that a state, or the leader of the state, has to be able to determine what other states in the international system they can peacefully coexist with, and what other states in the international system pose an existential threat to their own security and survival. And on the basis of those decisions, has to be able to make decisions to protect the security of the state in question, which overrides everything else. In other words, from the point of view of somebody like Carl Schmitt, and indeed from the point of view of many realists, what is considered politics among liberal pluralists is at best a footnote. Certainly, societies have to make decisions about who gets what, when, where, and how, and why, but all of that is subsidiary to the overall concern of survival. And in that sense, the understanding of politics put forward by Carl Schmitt and by those in the realist tradition of international relations studies tend to argue that foreign policy and international security and so on and so forth trumps domestic politics. No pun intended on that occasion. I don't want to reiterate that lecture, suffice it to say that one of the things that we're going to be seeing as we look at the foreign policies and the making of foreign policy in places like the United States, Britain, Germany, France, and so on, is the confrontation between the demands of democracy on the one hand and the demands of security on the other. And that this marks essentially one of the fault lines in political systems around the world. And in particular, focuses, of course, on the making of foreign policy. Can foreign policy be made on the basis of domestic institutions, on the basis of the competition between different individuals and groups that have different preferences over foreign policy? Or is foreign policy, or does foreign policy have to be made in a rational manner, as realists suggest, that's free from the constraints of the niceties of democracy or moral considerations and things along those lines? What I want to do today is to focus on a second concept that is going to be crucial for us to move forward in our understanding of foreign policy of different states in the international system. And that we also have some kind of clarity about in moving forward. And that is the core institution that is involved in the making of foreign policy, indeed of foreign policy in general, which we usually refer to as the state. And in that regard, it is important for us to understand the various attempts to conceptualize the nature of states and how they affect our understanding or our ability to study foreign policy. How they provide us a framework within which to try to understand foreign policy and provide us the ability to produce various hypotheses about the making of foreign policy that can be tested through experience. Now, as you might anticipate, a good place to start in our attempts to conceptualize the state and to relate it to the making of foreign policy is to start with the most common perceptions about what states are and how they function. And those most common perceptions of what states are and how they function derive from the school of thought that tends to be dominant, especially in the Anglo-Saxon tradition of political science and social analysis, and which we in political science tend to refer to as liberal pluralism. In the field of international relations, a closely related set of ideas is often referred to as idealism. And it derives to a certain extent from the perceptions or from the observation that I've already made about politics. If politics is understood by liberal pluralists as a competition of who gets what, when, where, and how, I can read you a few different definitions of politics from various scholars. Gerald Rosati, who defines it as who gets what, when, where, and how. Harold Laswell, who just defines it as a serious game with high stakes, one in which winners and losers affect many lives, yours, mine, those down the street and all over the world. Or Hedrick Smith, who defines it as competition for power and shared meaning. Or alternatively, competition between groups and individuals for control of the government, support of the public, influence throughout society to achieve and promote certain ends. If this is your understanding of the state, of politics, that politics is above all else about the competition between different groups and individuals within a society, the ideal kind of a state would necessarily have to be one that is neutral, that provides an arena within which that competition can take place by creating institutions, legislatures, courts, and elections, and so on and so forth, that allow for the competition between different groups and individuals within society, that channel conflict between these different groups and individuals into these institutions, and in which conflicts are settled through those institutions and are seen by all of those that participate in that competition as legitimate. And in order for those results to appear legitimate in the general public, the perception generally has to be that that competition is fair. In other words, that the state is a neutral entity through which that competition is channeled. That the outcome of these competitions aren't determined beforehand by powerful interests that hide behind the institutions and prejudice the outcomes of that competition. The understanding of the state by a liberal pluralist, therefore, both theoretically and to some extent historically, focuses on what is often called the contract model. Whereby the state derives its legitimacy in large part through a real or hypothetical contract with those over which it governs. And I don't want to delve into the long tradition of liberal political theory, starting with figures like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and continuing on into the present with political theorists like John Rawls, all of which focus on this idea of a hypothetical contract between the state and the public that give the state its legitimacy. This is something that is very much explicit in the context of American foreign policy, to a somewhat lesser extent, in the British system. In both the British and the American system, there are documents that are seen as this kind of social contract. In the context of the United States, is of course the U.S. Constitution. And in the context of Great Britain, it's the Magna Carta. Those are essentially the documents that spell out an agreement between the governed and those that are to govern over them as to what the rules of that government ought to be. One way of seeing this then is that for liberal, pluralist, thinkers, the state, above all else, is understood as what could be described as a dependent variable. A dependent variable. Now let me briefly explain what I mean by a dependent variable for those of you not familiar with science jargon. A dependent variable in an experiment is the thing that is being acted upon, not the thing that is active. The basic idea of this contract model of the state is that the state itself does not have any particular interest, does not have any particular prejudices toward one set of policies or another. That it is simply the thing that is being acted on by various groups and individuals and organizations and so on and so forth, each of which want to advance their interests. And it's the competition between these groups and individuals within the political system that determines policy. And it is also the competition between these groups and individuals and organizations and so on and so forth that shapes the foreign policy of a particular state, the aspect of which we're going to be interested in. If this is an accurate description of the making of foreign policy, really we wouldn't have to look much at international politics at all. We could look at foreign policy strictly through the lens of domestic politics, of what are the different preferences for policy of different groups, how well are they organized, and why can some groups advance their interests and shape foreign policy, and why do the ambitions or interests of others get frustrated in this overall process. But this would be something that would be largely rejected by especially those in the field of international relations that would certainly understand, as most of us do, that foreign policy is meant to address concerns and issues that are entirely beyond the influence of domestic actors. In other words, that to a considerable extent, foreign policy has to be shaped by events outside of the borders and forces outside of the borders of a particular political community. Now, Of course, we're not the only ones that thought about the state, and in order to advance our examination of foreign policy, it is worthwhile to look at a couple of other understandings of how policy is made and what the nature of the state is. And the next school of thought that I'll briefly examine is Marxism. Marxism. Now, many of you might well and justifiably ask, why the heck should we concern ourselves with Marxism? Hasn't communism proved to be a complete failure and discredited itself all over the planet and so on and so forth? And that may well be the case, but Marxist understandings of the state nonetheless are worth examining, I will argue, because they shine a more critical light in many ways on the nature of states than their liberal pluralist counterparts do. And because they derive with very different, or allow us to test very different kinds of hypotheses about the making of foreign policy. The first thing that I should note about Marxism, in contrast to liberalism, is that there's not a huge contrast between the two. Marxists, like their liberal pluralist counterparts, see the state as a dependent variable. A dependent variable. However, the nature of their understanding of the state in this regard is rather drastically different from their liberal pluralist counterparts. And the best way to explore that is simply to look very briefly at the writings of Karl Marx himself with regard to how he understood the nature of states, and to look at how neo-Marxists, more importantly those in the 20th and 21st century, have taken those perceptions by Marx and applied them in a more modern and contemporary context. Karl Marx, for those of you that haven't read much of Karl Marx, which is probably the majority of you, wrote an enormous volume of books and articles and so on and so forth, but almost none of them were about politics. The majority of his writings were on philosophy and economics. However, there were certain tidbits in which he did explore political aspects of modern life. And one of them was certainly his main pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, which was a pamphlet, a political pamphlet. And in that, he outlined his vision of what modern politics was, and basically stated that the executive of the modern state is merely the collective means by which the ruling class administers its common affairs. I paraphrase, I don't quote him directly, but the basic idea is fairly straightforward. The state is the tool of the dominant elites to keep themselves in power and to keep the masses under control. And he argues that has always been perfectly obvious throughout human history. Human history, according to his understanding of it, has devolved through various kinds of social systems. Beginning with what he called primitive communism, when there was no state, in other words, hunting and gathering societies. Primitive communism, by virtue of the fact that within hunting and gathering societies, there is by necessity absolute equality, because hunting and gathering societies have to be on the move on a regular basis, and consequently, personal possessions simply make no sense. You can't drag everything along with you if you have to traverse many hundreds of kilometers to follow your prey or your sources of food or water or what have you. And furthermore, primitive communism has absolute equality by virtue of the fact that it produces no surplus. In other words, that hunting and gathering societies only produce what they need for their daily existence. And consequently, he argued, since there is no surplus produced, there is also no change and no progress made in these hunting and gathering societies. Progress, from the way that Marx understood it, requires the production of a surplus within a society. A surplus meaning that not everyone within that society is on a daily basis involved in trying to meet their needs for their existence. Progress can only be made insofar as at least portions of human society are freed from the necessity to work, at least for part of the time of the day, and put their efforts into developing new forms of tools, new forms of technologies, and so on and so forth that can advance society. Marx argued that the moment that societies are capable of producing such a surplus, that surplus in all historical formations that he examined was usurped by one group at the expense of everyone else. In other words, the moment that societies produce a surplus, they become class societies. And class societies have evolved in various forms. The first form, and most primitive form, was slave-based societies, in which one group essentially captures slaves and forces them to do all of the menial work required for their daily existence, and simply exists off of the surplus that those slaves produce, which is usurped by the ruling elites, by the slave owners. In that case, insofar as they're state institutions, the function is fairly clear. The state institutions, the means of coercion that states invariably have, are used exclusively to protect the slave-owning class from the slaves, to keep the slaves in their place. In that sense, the state is a tool of the ruling elites. He argued subsequent social systems follow essentially the same pattern. That feudalism, which largely replaced slave-based societies after the collapse of the Greek and Roman empires, which were largely based on slavery. Feudalism is a system more advanced and more progressive than slave-based societies, in that it provides a certain amount of autonomy to all of its citizens, including the peasants that are at the very bottom of that pyramid. But it is still nonetheless a class-based system in which the nobility controls the majority and extracts the surplus that they produce, not through direct control over their workplace and direct control over their bodies, but rather by the control of land. The nobility owns the land, the peasants have to give up part of the product of that land in return to gain access to it, or title to it. And once again, the institutions of the state in feudal societies were primarily the tools by which the ruling elites maintained themselves in power and kept their peasant populations under control. There's of course a lot more to it. Feudal lords did not on a constant basis require the protection of mercenaries and soldiers and so on to protect them from their peasants. There was a whole ideological construction around that in Western Europe, primarily the idea that the social order was one that was dictated by God. In other words, it was closely tied to Catholicism, and that therefore rejecting your place within that society was rejecting the will of God and made you a heretic. And that meant that if you, as a peasant, said, hey, I don't want to be a peasant, I want to be something else, you were essentially a heretic. And what happened to heretics in medieval Europe? Generally, they were made a nasty example of, so that nobody else gets any stupid ideas. And among the more creative ways of dealing with them was what we now know as being drawn and quartered, which was a uniquely impressive way of dealing with heretics, in which they were brought into the town square, and usually the entire town was forced to watch as they sliced open their gut, pull out their lower intestine, tie it to a rod, and force them to walk around the rod until they no longer could. And collapsed, at which point they were quartered, which meant that their four limbs were tied to four horses, and somebody cracked the whip, and they were torn into four pieces. And if you watch somebody being subjected to that treatment, even if you had some ideas about not wanting to be a peasant, you keep them to yourselves. And in that regard, it's quite clear that the institutions of the state were intended to keep a ruling elite in power, and only for that purpose. That the institutions of the state, insofar as they existed, in their modern concept, in their modern form, were the tools of the ruling elites. Now, making that argument in capitalist societies is a little bit more tricky, but in Karl Marx's time, wasn't particularly difficult. In Karl Marx's time, not a single industrial country, including the ones in which he did most of his research, Germany and Great Britain, were democracies. Each of them were monarchies in which ruling elites very clearly dominated the political system. And in which, while in Germany there was some aspect of voting, and while in the 19th century there was the beginnings of the process of the development of the House of Commons that slowly started to have a little bit more power to challenge the dominance of the ruling elites. Nonetheless, nobody would argue that Great Britain or Germany or any other capitalist country in the region were really democracies. One possible exception to that might have been the United States, but that's an exception that we're going to look at in much more detail. In that context, he argued that capitalism isn't really any different from feudalism or communism, or slave-based systems. The only difference is that whereas slave-based systems were based on the ownership of people, and feudalism was based on the ownership of land, capitalism is based on the ownership of capital. One group of individuals within society owns capital, and the other that do not own capital, therefore have no choice but to sell their labor power on the market in order to gain access to the means of production, in order to earn a wage. And when earning a wage, those workers are invariably paid less than they actually produce. In other words, they are exploited. And the difference between what they produce and what they are paid is what eventually becomes profit. Now, in the 19th century, making the argument that the capitalist state in Great Britain or the capitalist state in Germany were tools of the ruling elites wasn't particularly difficult. In essence, whenever workers attempted to defend their interests by forming unions, by joining strikes and so on and so forth, the heavy hand of the state came down on them pretty hard, pretty quickly, making it fairly evident whose interests the states supported. The states were, of course, interested in gaining access to taxation, to taxable funds, and taxable funds required capitalists, and consequently were more than happy to act on behalf of those capitalists. And in that regard, the state certainly still was the tool of the dominant elites. In the 20th century, however, that's an argument that's a little bit more difficult to make. In the 20th century, most of the dominant capitalist countries, for most of the time, have been functioning liberal democracies. And in functioning liberal democracies, it's a little harder to make the claim that these liberal democracies are simply the tool of the dominant elites. But that is essentially the position of Marxists. Now, in the 20th century, Marxism in that context has taken a slightly different form, or rather has spurred debates with one school of thought in this context being identified as instrumentalists. Among the most prominent names associated with instrumentalist Marxism are the writer C. Wright Mills, in the context of the United States, who wrote a very influential book called The Power Elite. And in the context of Great Britain, Ralph Miliband, who wrote a book entitled The Capitalist State, that outlined essentially a Marxist understanding of the state in the 20th century. These two came to very similar conclusions. And essentially, the basis of how those, or the way that they reached those conclusions, is that they looked at the nature of the elites that control the corporate world on the one hand, and the top echelons of the state on the other. And what they found, both in Great Britain and the United States, probably wouldn't surprise you enormously. Essentially, what they found is that the top elites within the corporate world and the top elites within the state are virtually identical. In other words, they have very similar family backgrounds, come from similar wealthy families. They tend to have attended the same educational institutions, elite educational institutions. In the case of Great Britain, Oxford and Cambridge. In the case of the United States, the Ivy League schools and so on and so forth. As members of influential families and attendees at these elite institutions, they tended to join the same kind of country clubs and social institutions and so on and so forth. And consequently had very similar outlooks with regard to politics, with regard to economics and so on. And in that regard, they argued it's not that surprising that those that dominate the institutions of the state will reflect the same kinds of interests and the same kinds of perceptions as their corporate counterparts in the private sector. But they went a step further than that and found also that in looking at the career paths of people within the corporate world and the career paths of people within the top echelons of the state, they found that there was a kind of a revolving door relationship between the two, and that prevailed both in Britain and the United States. In other words, that people that made their careers within the corporate world and reached the top echelons of the corporate world would often take positions in Washington or London for a few years and serve in government functions. And then once that government is defeated or they've finished their government functions, return back to the private sector. And this is something that's also fairly evident even to this day. If you think back about the controversies around the economic collapse of 2008, one of the things that became very evident is the extent to which the Treasury Department of the United States is virtually identical with the institutions that it is supposed to control. Institutions like major banks and investment houses like Goldman Sachs. And one of the things that became fairly evident is that virtually everyone that worked in the Treasury Department had previously worked at Goldman Sachs. Now, why would somebody that's making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars at Goldman Sachs ever want to work for the Treasury Department, where they're at best going to get a salary of a couple $100,000? Well, the reason is because it fits into their career path. In other words, it's a good career move. You work in the Fed or the Treasury for a couple of years, you make all sorts of useful connections in Washington. And when you quit that job, you apply for your old job back at Goldman Sachs, and you won't get your old job back. You'll get one that's a couple of ranks higher and with an even bigger salary and so on. And why do you have that? Is by virtue of the fact that you can pull strings in Washington that you previously couldn't pull under the previous circumstances. So in that sense, that revolving door relationship makes perfect sense. And if the executives in major corporations and the top echelons of the government on a regular basis trade places, it's again not that surprising that the interests of the dominant elites will prevail over the interests of lower classes that don't have that kind of access. And in that sense, they argue that despite the trappings of democracy, the state is still largely an instrument of those dominant classes. However, the situation is a little bit more complicated than what it was in the 19th century. And the reason it's a little bit more complex is because we do live in democracies in the 20th century, or most of the countries we're looking at are democracies. And democracies can't allow themselves to be perceived as merely tools of a small dominant elite. They have to maintain the legitimacy in the eyes of the general public. And consequently, instrumentalists have come up with this idea of the relative autonomy of the state. The relative autonomy of the state. The basic idea here is that if the state, or the government that controls the state, on a regular basis simply adopts the policies favored by a narrow elite, it will undermine its own legitimacy. And that, to a certain extent, is already relatively evident. If you look at current history, and we were just talking about the environmental, the economic crash of 2008. The economic crash of 2008 made a lot of these things very obvious to your average American that usually didn't concern themselves with these matters. Made it fairly evident that it was Wall Street that wrote the rules that govern banks through their control of Congress and the executive branch, and wrote rules that allowed them to enrich themselves at a fabulous rate and tank much of the American economy. What was the response to that by the American public?
So Republicans were voted in because of...
Well, actually, Republicans were voted out in 2008.
But then they were voted in
But
again.
this problem actually crosses both parties. Mr. Obama went straight ahead and hired another Goldman Sachs executive to run the Fed for him. So in that sense, there's not much of a difference. The thing I was looking for is Occupy Wall Street. People got pissed off. And the fact that they didn't get more pissed off than they were is rather miraculous. Many people were expecting people to hit the streets with pitchforks and to go after their bankers and so on and so forth. Given that large millions of people lost their homes, while a handful of people enriched themselves enormously on the basis of their control of government policy. I don't want to get too much into that, but what you get is basically that this undermining of legitimacy of the state is a fundamental problem for democracy. And consequently, states can't be perceived simply as always defending the interests of a small elite. They have to compromise to a certain extent in order to maintain that legitimacy. And that's where that relative autonomy comes from. On occasion, the state has to be perceived to be acting in the public interest, not merely in the interests of the dominant elites. And in that regard, it explains that 20th century capitalism is somewhat different from 19th century capitalism, when that concern simply didn't exist, or didn't exist to the same extent. In the 20th century, the working class has been able to push through various compromises, like legalizing labor unions that were considered illegal during the 19th century, both in Britain and the United States, like imposing minimum wages to allow people to make a living wage, like creating social security systems and welfare systems and insurance employment and so on. These are means by which the state certainly compromises on the demands of the ruling elites, none of which have any interest in any of those institutions, and fight them for tooth and nail, but by doing so, maintain the image of legitimacy in the eyes of the general public. Now, this might all sound reasonably convincing as a means of making Marxism relevant to the 20th and 21st century, but not all Marxists agree with this perception of the state either. Before we get to the other Marxists, however, one of the things that I want to tie this back to is understandings of foreign policy. If we look at foreign policy decisions and try to explain them, these different theories provide us with different hypotheses. So, for example, since we're going to be taking up the American foreign policy process next, we might as well start with American examples. The United States made the decision in 2003 to invade Iraq. A decision that at this point is seen by most people, not all. John Bolton, who just got fired as a national security advisor by Donald Trump the day before yesterday, still to this day says it was the right thing to do. But he's probably one of the very few people that still sticks to that opinion. Well, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, and the question might be, why? Why did they do it? They turned into a disaster, for Iraq at least, and to a considerable extent to the United States. Why did they do it? Well, one explanation, the one that would be put forward by liberal pluralists, would be that the United States, well, exactly 18 years ago yesterday, was attacked in New York and Washington on September 11th of 2001, which was one of the biggest shocks to the American public in its history, comparable to Pearl Harbor, perhaps even more severe than Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a place that most Americans didn't even know existed at the time that it was attacked. The World Trade Centers and the Pentagon were right at the core of American power, and were indeed the symbols of American power, and were chosen specifically for that reason. Under those circumstances, the American public was screaming for blood. Something had to be done. Somebody had to pay for this. And consequently, the Bush administration picked out Afghanistan and Iraq as the targets, as the culprits. Of course, I don't want to get into debates about that. All of that is somewhat absurd. There wasn't a single Afghani among the hijackers, nor was there a single Iraqi among the hijackers. 15 of the 18 hijackers were Saudis, and the other 3, I believe, were Egyptians. In that sense, landing Iraq and Afghanistan was in and of itself somewhat problematic. Suffice it to say, however, that's one explanation, is that the Bush administration had to do something. Don't just stand there, do something. Otherwise he wouldn't have gotten reelected. Is that a sufficient explanation? Is that an explanation that we would find convincing? Well, it might be convincing for why they did something, but it might not be particularly convincing for why they chose Iraq in particular, which turned out to have absolutely nothing to do with September 11th. Afghanistan, they could at least say that Osama bin Laden was holding up in Afghanistan. Well, what are the alternatives to that? Well, one alternative, certainly put forward by instrumentalist Marxists, is to look at the Bush administration itself. And in that case, it doesn't become very much of a mystery why they picked out Iraq as a target to respond to in the context of September 11th. And this was something that was implicitly recognized by large portions of the public in the United States that held demonstrations before the war even began, in which they all held up placards. Anyone know what those placards read? Or most of them anyway?
That's your right?
Pardon? No, that might have been in Iran or in Iraq or something along those lines. I'm talking about on the streets of Washington, D.C. and New York City and places like that, where there were substantial demonstrations before the war even began. And the posters generally have things like "No blood for oil." And that suggests something fairly straightforward, that the attack on Iraq was not motivated by September 11th or the rage of the public, as the liberals and pluralists might see it, but was an act of greed. And if you look at the Bush administration, that's a fairly credible argument to make. Mr. Bush himself comes from a family that became fabulously wealthy and was up into their neck in the oil industry in Texas and elsewhere. Dick Cheney, likewise, is closely connected to the oil industry, the vice president, and apparently, according to many, the person that shaped the Bush administration's foreign policy. So much so that there were jokes at the time in the first Bush administration that it would be horrible if Dick Cheney was assassinated, because then George Bush would be president. George Bush was president, but many consider him to have been a lightweight that was basically managed by the more knowledgeable people behind him, like Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was the CEO of the Halliburton Corporation prior to assuming the vice presidency. The Halliburton Corporation is the biggest contractor for the oil industry. It builds oil platforms and pipelines and things along those lines. Donald Rumsfeld, as Secretary of Defense, was heavily involved in the pharmaceutical industry, which also has very close connections to the oil industry. In that context, it makes perfect sense why they decided to take the opportunity offered by the attacks of September 11th to do something that they wanted to do anyway, get access to Iraqi oil. Is that a complete explanation? Will we all buy that explanation? Well, let's not jump to that conclusion yet. But essentially, it is a hypothesis that is suggested by this understanding of the state. And it's for that reason that I bring up these different theoretical approaches. It's not just to bore you guys all to tears and hope that many of you drop the course on my grading load is diminished. That's part of it. But the main reason is that I think it will allow us to ask some critical questions about making the foreign policy in various contexts. Now, as I pointed out, the instrumentalists do not have a monopoly on Marxist understandings of the state. Indeed, many Marxists reject this understanding. And those Marxists generally tend to be identified as structuralist. Structuralists. That see the entire picture in a very, very different way, but come to somewhat similar conclusions. In essence, what these structuralists, and among them are some very prominent names, like Nicholas Palampsas, and Fred Bloch. What these theorists essentially argue is that the instrumentalist understanding of Marxism is fundamentally flawed in ways that might not immediately seem obvious. Essentially, what Fred Bloch, for example, argues in a very good article entitled "The Ruling Class Does Not Rule," is that the basis, the assumption that Marxist instrumentalists make, which he considers entirely false and faulty, is that unlike the working class, which Marxists have always claimed, suffers from a lack of class consciousness. In other words, that workers do not see themselves as a class, and therefore do not act as a class to advance their interests. Instead, they get bogged down in various conflicts between themselves over issues that are largely irrelevant, like gun control and abortion and things along those lines that divide them against themselves. Workers do not see themselves primarily as workers and do not act primarily as workers in the political system, and therefore don't bring about the kinds of reforms that Marxists would expect them to advocate for, and certainly don't bring about revolution. Revolution requires that the working class get conscious of its exploitation and of its common interests and organize on the basis of that. The assumption instrumentalists make that is that unlike the working class, the ruling class is in fact class conscious, does share all those interests and act in accordance to those interests. And he argues that there's absolutely no reason to assume that is the case. That in fact, it is demonstrable that it is not the case. Capitalists are not conscious of their interests in common, in large part because they don't have common interests. Capitalists are always in competition with other capitalists, and consequently have very different interests, depending on what sector of the economy they're involved in. So on a simple issue, like free trade, for example, there will be capitalists that will line up strongly in favor of free trade, because it provides them access to foreign markets, provides them easy access to foreign resources and so on, and therefore allows them to increase their profits. But there will be just as many capitalists that will line up against for free trade, insofar as they therefore have to compete with producers in other countries that have lower labor costs, lower environmental standards, and so on and so forth. In other words, there is no unified capitalist interest. Capitalism, by its very nature, puts capitalists in competition with other capitalists, and consequently means that there is no common interest. So does that mean that since the capitalists do not have a common interest and are not class conscious and don't act as a unified class, that therefore the state is indeed a neutral entity? Well, structuralists certainly wouldn't go that far. If they did, they wouldn't be Marxists. What makes them Marxist is that they feel, nonetheless, that the state is a dependent variable and acts first and foremost to perpetuate the class differences within the capitalist system. So how do we understand that? Well, as the title suggests, it is structural forces, not individual forces, that shape the state or the activities of the state. And let me briefly explain what I mean by that, or what something like Fred Bloch means by that. The easiest way of doing so is simply to provide you with a very quick example or thought experiment, is probably a better way of putting it. Let's say that in the 2020 elections, Donald Trump does not win. We'll probably a little bit hopeful for that, but it's anything but a guarantee. And that the Democratic candidate also flounders, and instead Jill Stein, the Green candidate, is elected president. Now, I know that she doesn't have an ice cream chance in hell of becoming president of the United States in 2020, but just for this brief thought experiment, let's assume that she does. Now, how many of you are familiar with the Green Party and their basic precepts? What do they want? What do the Greens want? What was Jill Stein likely to have been elected to do?
The Green New Deal and it's
A radical Green New Deal. A radical Green New Deal that gets the United States off of carbon-based fuels and so on and so forth, imposes much more strict environmental regulations in various other ways and so on and so forth. Now, if she was elected on November 4th of next year, what would you expect the headlines on November 5th on the New York Times to be? Well, on the one hand, obviously, the headline would be, in a complete shock, Jill Stein wins the vote in the Electoral College. But the next line down, what would that likely be?
communist takeover of the.
Pardon me?
The communist takeover of the free trade system and free market capitalism.
Maybe not quite that, but yeah.
Well, what I think would happen is a different kind of capitalist would just take over, like people like Elon Musk who are invested in like Tesla and green energy.
In the long run, that might well be the case. It's not entirely clear that environmentalism is anti-capitalist, you're quite right. But that will take some time. The immediate response would be the headline, in a shock, Jill Stein gets the presidency. The next line down, or the next article down would be stock market crashes. basically investors. And investors that want to invest their money can only invest their money insofar as they can calculate the risks that are involved in investing their money. And the risks involved in investing their money depend on, well, what industry are they investing in and how profitable is that industry. And the profitability of that industry depends, on the one hand, on the price of the products that they produce, but on the other hand, on the costs that are involved in producing that product. And making investments means that you, as any capitalist would know, is that you very carefully calculate your costs and then try to anticipate your income on the basis of the costs that you've incurred to see whether that investment is worthwhile. Now, if you can't figure out what the costs are, can you invest? Are you likely to invest? And the problem would be that once she was elected, the anticipation would be that she would push up the costs of production by pushing up environmental regulations and so on and so forth. But that nobody would precisely knows what her policies are. In other words, how extensive those policies are going to be. And under those circumstances, no one can make informed investment decisions. And consequently, all investors will hold back. Now, what can poor Jill Stein do in the Oval Office in response to this sudden turn of events? Basically, what that boils down to is that capitalists have gone on a capital strike, the equivalent of a labor strike. In a labor strike, laborers withhold their labor in order to get a higher price for it. In a capital strike, capitalists simply refuse to invest their money, basically because they can't make a profit or don't know whether they can make a profit. So what could poor Jill Stein do?
She could create clear policies that would allow investors to make informed decisions.
That's more or less right. Well, she has actually two choices. One is she can go full on Stalin. In other words, she can say, okay, you don't want to invest your money? I'm taking your money and I'll invest it for you. In other words, nationalize everything and let the government decide what to invest in and so on, like the Soviet Union did during much of its history. Probably not a great idea, and I very much doubt that Jill Stein would be inclined to go in that direction. The only other alternative that she has is to say, hey, you capitalists, don't worry. I'm not going to do all the radical things that I said to get elected. I'm going to be really mellow and really make some minor adjustments that won't cut into your profits drastically and so on. In other words, to convince them to reinvest their money. And what that suggests is it doesn't really matter who's elected to become the President of the United States or the Prime Minister. They will be forced to, because of these structural realities, to largely adopt the same kinds of policies as their predecessors. And this is a pattern that we've seen on numerous occasions in very different kinds of contexts. But, for example, Mr. Obama came to power, promising all sorts of reforms that his Republican predecessors were unwilling to adopt. Early on, he favored a single-payer healthcare system and so on, before he got the Democratic nomination. And when it was useful to appeal to his Democratic voters by advocating that policy. The second that he got the nomination, he started to become considerably more moderate. He started to distance himself from the idea of a single-payer system and said, well, if that's what Congress comes up with, great, but we'll let Congress deal with it. And he knew perfectly well that Congress wouldn't come up with a single-payer system. And he backed down on all sorts of other kinds of promises as well. In essence, because he was faced with these structural realities. Essentially what happens when policies are announced by government that are inimical to the interests of the dominant elites is that the stock market will start to decline. As the stock market declines, the ability of the government to tax declines with it as economic activity diminishes. At the same time that economic activity diminishes, the costs faced by the state increase because more people will be collecting unemployment, more people will be collecting social security checks and so on and so forth. And that immediately confronts the state with what is referred to as a fiscal crisis. And to get out of that fiscal crisis, you have to get capitalists to invest. Without that, you can't do anything. And these structural realities essentially mean that the state will pursue policies that are positive for the economy. However, it's still not quite that simple. Structuralists nonetheless argue that despite all of this, there is, again, this relative autonomy of the state. But they see it in a very different way. The relative autonomy of the state. In essence, what they argue is that the role of the state and those that lead the state is inherently different from simply maximizing profits on behalf of their corporate clients. That the role of the state is not to defend the interests of individual capitalists, but rather to maintain the stability of the capitalist system as a whole. And that this requires, absolutely requires, that the state have some autonomy from the dominant elites within that economy. Because maintaining the stability of the state, of capitalism, requires, on important occasions, that the state be able to act against the interests of the dominant elites, not simply with them. Probably the best argument that has been made to illustrate this was put forward in a volume called Bringing the State Back In by Ruschmeyer and Faber-Skotchpole, in which in particular Faber-Skotchpole analyzed the New Deal in the United States. The New Deal, most of you probably are only familiar with the Green New Deal that has been proposed by the Green Party nowadays by some Democrats. It takes its name from the New Deal that was initially brought into effect by the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression. In order to understand that set of policies, it's important to a certain extent to understand the nature of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was one of those downturns in the capitalist economy, somewhat predicted by people like Karl Marx. Karl Marx argued that capitalism was going to come to an end, but he argued that it wouldn't come to an end because it was a failure. It would come to an end because of its enormous success. In fact, while most of us understand Karl Marx as a critic of capitalism, he was not at all a critic of capitalism. He called capitalism the great locomotive of history by virtue of the fact that it, as a social system, more than any other possible alternative, would advance the means of production because it constantly forces innovation, constantly forces investments in more advanced technology. But he argued that all of these advances ultimately undermine the stability of capitalism itself. And while I'm grossly oversimplifying some of his arguments in this, for those of you that are more familiar with Marx and feel offended by my simplification of his arguments, a straightforward, simple version of that is that capitalism, by forcing capitalists to constantly compete with each other and to take the form in that competition of constantly reinvesting and trying to get more competitive advantage through better technology, through better use of labor power and so on, consistently diminish the amount of labor that's necessary in order to produce the goods that they're producing. In other words, they crank out more and more goods using less and less labor. That's how they gain a competitive advantage. Now, if every capitalist in the capitalist system is doing that, the aggregate result of that will be an increase in the amounts of goods on the market and a decrease in the purchasing power of the public to be able to absorb all those goods. In other words, by necessity, the success of capitalism will lead to deflation, to a situation in which there is simply more goods on the market than there is money to buy them, which pushes prices downward. And when prices go downward, capitalists go bankrupt because of the calculations that they made about their expenses that they would incur and the likely profits they would be able to make aren't realized because the price that they can fetch for their goods that they produced 5 or 6 years after they made their investments are half of what they anticipated. And then they throw their workers out of work. And what does that do to the aggregate demand within the system? Well, it pushes even further down. And that means essentially what happens is that there's a sort of downward spiral of deflation, unemployment, producing more deflation, and so on. And that appeared to be what was happening during the Great Depression. How to get out of it? Well, the New Deal was a good indication of it. Of course, I'm giving you a partial version of this because what ultimately got the United States out of the Great Depression wasn't as much the New Deal as it was World War II, which had very much the same kind of implications. But basically, as Lord Keynes, the father of Keynesian economics, pointed out, it's pretty simple. If you have a problem of deflation, of dropping prices, all you have to do is pump more money into the system. Keynes actually said, just print up money, throw it out the window of the treasury. It doesn't matter how you pump it in the system, just get money in the system. As soon as you got more money in the system, there's more demand. As soon as there's more demand, people can start making profits and so on and so forth. So how did the New Deal do this? Well, it did it, first of all, by increasing the purchasing power of the working class. And it did that by two different means, predominantly. One was the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act, for the first time, established the legality of labor unions. And the other was through the passage of minimum wage legislation. Now, how do you think capitalists felt about being forced to pay their workers minimum wage and being forced to accept the existence of labor unions?
They didn't like it?
Not very good. They fought tooth and nail against it. There were a couple of exceptions to that, of progressive capitalists that recognized the necessity of this kind of thing, but they were few and far between. For the most part, capitalists fought tooth and nail against it, and indeed continue to fight tooth and nail against it in the current environment, since the 1970s, when the opportunities seemed to arise to reverse some of these policies. But the upshot of that was that essentially demand was increased and profits started to flow, and capitalists ultimately began to make profits again. Now, the reason why capitalists are going to be against this is because they're looking at their own bottom line. And if they're told, well, you're going to have to accept labor unions, that labor union is going to push your wage costs up higher, they're going to say, no way, because that'll drive me out of business. Because they assume that their competitors don't have to do the same thing. The only way that you can institute this kind of thing is to push it across the board. And that means that the state, in order to defend the long-term stability of the capitalist system, which was very much in question in the 1930s, had to be able to be in a position to act against the interests of the dominant elites. And the only way they could do that is not to be simple instruments of those dominant elites. Is by being able to have enough autonomy from those interests to be able to look at what was necessary for to maintain the stability of the big picture. Now, what does that tell us about foreign policy decisions and things along those lines? Well, one way of looking at that is that certainly structuralist Marxists would not discount the possibility that the state acts in accordance to these connections between, described by C. Wright Mills and David Miliband, in making policy decisions. But what they would argue is that insofar as individual capitalists, through their connections, can influence the government to make certain decisions, that this is counterproductive for the system as a whole. As the relationship between Wall Street and the Treasury clearly demonstrates in the 2008 elections. And in that regard, they would also argue that insofar as the Bush administration made the decision to invade Iraq because of its close connections to the oil industry and as a favor to their buddies that are going to be making more profits off of oil in Iraq, this is a problem. This is not the way it's supposed to work, even under a capitalist system. So why, in that case, might the United States, if we can assume that they acted rationally in their pursuit of their interests in the decision to invade Iraq, have made that decision? Well, if it really was just a matter of doing their favors for their buddies in the oil industry, it was a problem, not something that should be lauded or should be accepted. But they would argue that there probably was more behind it. That wasn't simply a matter of oil. And indeed, the oil companies have not done particularly well out of Iraq. They were, for the most part, being excluded from Iraq because of the intervention that overthrew Hussein. Why else might they have done so? Well, one of the things that they would point to is the larger interest of the capitalist system as a whole, of which the United States is to a large extent the center, and in a position that very much wants to continue to occupy. So what threat could Iraq possibly have made that would justify such an intervention? One suggestion, again, I'm really guessing here, and I'm only suggesting these hypotheses, not as full explanations, but one suggestion is that the real problem with Saddam Hussein was not his support for or his weapons of mass destruction, which of course we know didn't exist, or his support for Al-Qaeda, which we also know didn't exist. The real problem was that in part because of the sanctions that he faced since the 1990 intervention, his hostility to the United States overall, he wanted to figure out how to get out of from under American dominance, and opened up investigations into exporting Iraqi oil on the basis of the euro, not the US dollar. And had he been successful at doing that, essentially this would have represented a fundamental threat to the stability of the American economy, because the American dollar's value is what economists today define as a fiat dollar. In other words, the dollar is not tied to any real value like gold, as it was prior to 1973. The dollar's worth what everyone thinks it's worth, and nothing more. And if all of us stop believing that the dollar's worth anything, it will be worth nothing. It's not quite that simple. The other alternative understanding of the US dollar is what is often referred to as the petrodollar. In other words, that the basis of the value of the US dollar, after it went off the gold standard, was no longer its value in gold, but was the fact that every country in the world, if they wanted to purchase oil for their own domestic use, had to purchase it in the form of dollars. And that essentially meant that there was a permanent demand for dollars through this oil system, and that individual countries suddenly deciding, we're not abiding by this, we're going to sell it directly in euros or in yuan or some other currency, would fundamentally undermine the US dominance of that overall system. Again, I'm merely throwing that out as a possibility in from a structuralist perspective, not as a truth to be accepted. But nonetheless, it opens some possibilities in terms of understanding the different hypotheses that these different theoretical approaches suggest in terms of understanding foreign policy. Now, the liberals and the Marxists, of course, do not have a monopoly on understandings of the state. In that context, it is very important for us to understand at least one other alternative view of states, which departs in a very important way from all of these understandings of the state, in particular in terms of the understanding of the state as a dependent variable. What I'm talking about here is the approach to understanding the state taken by those that are generally described as realists. Realists. Realists argue primarily against their liberal pluralist counterparts that see the state as a dependent variable and understand the state on the basis of this contract model. That understanding of the state is historically inaccurate and really kind of a ideological construct more than a form of social analysis. In essence, they argue that the actions of states are neither a reflection of democratic institutions, the way that liberal pluralists would have it, nor a reflection of the capitalist system, as Marxists would have it, either in the instrumentalist or the structuralist understanding thereof. States embody their own kind of rationality, Now, what do they mean by that, and how do they come to that conclusion? In essence, probably the best articulation of this point of view has been done by a number of realist writers that have come at this largely through their analysis of the history of the rise of states in the international system. In particular, the rise of the Westphalian state system that currently dominates the global international order. How did the system come into being? How did these states come into being? Well, one of the things that they would certainly point out is that with the minor exceptions of the United States and Great Britain, and even there, arguably, the states didn't derive from the creation, from the Constitution, or from the Magna Carta, but simply that in the case of the Magna Carta was a document that emerged in the context of an existing political order dominated by a king who was resented by other nobles for exceeding his power. And consequently, the Magna Carta was simply an agreement that was forced upon the king to abide or to respect the interests of the other nobles. and therefore limit his power. In the case of the U.S. Constitution, the institutions of the state were created by the colonial administration of Great Britain. And the American state, as it existed, then broke away from Britain and then created the Constitution, which formed those basic institutions that continue to govern the United States to this day. Both of these cases are in that regard somewhat exceptional, but the idea that the states were simply created through these social contracts is an oversimplification. A more accurate understanding of the rise of modern states, they would argue, would note that modern states, as they exist today, emerged in Western Europe. Emerged in Western Europe in the period that led up to the Peace of Westphalia, and were created not through a contract system, but rather through what is often referred to as an extraction coercion. Cycle. An extraction coercion cycle. The best example, the one that is often cited in this regard, is the rise of the Prussian state. The rise of the Prussian state in what is now eastern Germany and parts of Poland began with Frederick William inheriting the throne of Brandenburg. At the time, it was a relatively minor little fiefdom in Central Europe. He had no administration at the time and controlled 8,000 mercenaries. That was pretty much the basis of his power. And on the basis of that power, he made use of his mercenaries, apparently, in order to extract resources from his subject population, as all nobles or feudal lords during the Middle Ages in Western Europe did. But unlike his counterparts in other parts of Europe, rather than using the resources simply for his own consumption needs, he used them in order to hire more mercenaries. And then use those mercenaries in order to expand his territory. And then use that expanded territory in order to extract more resources. And then use those resources in order to hire more mercenaries, and so on and so forth. And by doing so, essentially create Prussia as the dominant state within Germany, which ultimately was able to successfully unify Germany under its control and become one of the great powers of Western Europe. In that process, however, things become a little bit more complicated. Certainly it starts with simply 8,000 mercenaries that extract resources from their subject populations. Now, how do mercenaries get resources from the subject population?
Violence.
Pardon me?
Violence and
It
corruption.
usually involved a considerable amount of violence. Essentially, what it amounted to is that the nobleman would say that, go rape and pillage that village, get what you can, and give me a share of it. In other words, enrich yourself, but you're going to have to give a share of it up to me. It's a form of taxation, but it's a rather simple form of taxation. And the problem with that form of taxation is that it doesn't provide a regular revenue stream. In other words, that once you pillage the village once, it's not going to be worth pillaging again for another 20, 30, 40 years until it can build its wealth back up and be worth taxing again. And that imposes a kind of a limit on the ability to extract that is ultimately counterproductive. And consequently, leads very quickly to a more elaborate or more sophisticated way of extracting resources, meaning collecting only the surplus that a village is able to produce on a year-by-year basis. But you can't use mercenaries to do that. In order to do that, you need accountants to figure out exactly what the surplus is, how much a particular village is able to afford before they all starve to death, and so on and so forth. And that becomes a much more complicated process. Consequently, that rise of the state eventually required some kind of administration. First and foremost, to collect taxes in a more efficient manner. The other problem with mercenaries, and a problem that's closely related, is that if you don't provide your mercenaries with opportunities to enrich themselves, they don't remain loyal to you. And they become one of the threats to your own stability. And that in turn meant that you constantly had to expand the territory and capture new villages in order to keep the loyalty of or to provide opportunities for those mercenaries to enrich themselves. But all of that ultimately doesn't work very well. And consequently, Frederick William very quickly recognized that mercenaries were not a good way of going, that a better way of going was to establish a military institution in which the income derived by those members of the military institution are paid directly by the state, not the result of pillage. And that made those soldiers directly dependent on the leader and consequently more reliable. It goes further than that. One of the other realizations that they were made very quickly is that once you establish a military, the biggest threat to your own rulership comes from that military and from the top echelons of it. And consequently, you want to make sure that your generals aren't the ones that are going to overthrow you. How do you do that? Well, the predominant way that states have dealt with that is that they provide their military only with the kinds of tools useful in capturing foreign territory, but not the kinds of tools that allow them to challenge the domestic government. And one way of doing that is to separate the military from the police. The police keeps domestic order, the military is focused on the external order and so on. In other words, out of this process of extraction and coercion, modern states slowly emerged. And one of the things that should be fairly evident in this regard is that with Frederick William initiating this kind of a process, it put all of his neighbors in a very peculiar position. What did his neighbors have as a choice in responding to what they were seeing happening in Prussia? Precisely. Either they adopt the same methods and build their own kind of state institutions, or they get gobbled up by Prussia. Pretty straightforward. And consequently, other states necessarily responded to the rise of their neighbors in organizing themselves in similar types of ways. Now, Charles Tilly, in his article, War Making and State Making as Organized Crime, presents a somewhat more sophisticated understanding of this overall process. But essentially, the argument that he makes is that states, far from being the tools of other groups, either voters and so on, or capitalists, are enterprises that defend their own interests and that have their own rationality in doing so. And that the best way to understand states in this context is to understand them as analogous to protection rackets. Do you all know what's meant by a protection racket? For those of you not familiar with protection rackets, they're pretty straightforward. Essentially, they're the kind of things that mafia bosses did in many cities around the world, continue to do in many cities around the world. That the mafia boss walks through his neighborhood, sees a nice store, and he goes in the store and says, "Man, this is a really nice store you've got here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. You give me $25 a week, and I'll make sure nothing happens to it." And if the store owner says, "Well, I don't see anything happening to it, I don't need to give you $25, the next day he'll find his window broken. And then he might come, "Oh, how did that happen? Maybe you should give me that $25. And if he still doesn't give it, then the next time the place will be burned down, and so on and so forth. In other words, that the protection comes from the same person that's offering the threat. And in this regard, he argues that states largely function on the same basis. They also justify their collection of taxes on the basis of providing protection from some theoretical enemy that was going to cause some harm to the public. But if the public or elements of the public refuse to pay those taxes, guess who would damage them first? You don't need to guess too hard. In essence, he argued that, and there's numerous protection rackets of that sort, and one of my favorite ones in that regard was that I went on a trip to Jamaica once with a friend, and we wanted to go to see a cave in the middle of the island, and there's no buses or anything that goes to this cave. So we rented a motorcycle to go up into the middle of nowhere to see this cave. And we found this dirt path going up to this cave, and got to 100 yards from the cave. And all of a sudden, all these little kids come running out of the woods. "Hey, you guys want to see the caves? Yeah, we'll show you where they are." And by the way, if you give me $5, I'll make sure nothing happens to your motorcycle. You're sort of thinking, well, we're in the middle of nowhere. What could happen to my motorcycle? And very quickly, it dawns on you, you better give me the $5 or you're going to have a flat tire and get out of the cave. In any event, states in this regard are similar kinds of enterprises. First and foremost, motivated by their own interests, which are related to the logic of states themselves not to the logic of democracy or capitalism. And he argues in this regard that modern states emerge out of the overlap of 4 different processes. The first, he argued, is war making. War making is the core function of most states, at least in their inception. And he defines war making as the elimination or neutralization of external wielders of power. The attempt by a wielder of power, in this case perhaps Frederick William or anyone else, to eliminate or neutralize external wielders of force or power, keeping at bay external enemies. Pretty straightforward. The second function is what he described as state making. And what he meant by state making is eliminating or neutralizing domestic wielders of power. Eliminating or neutralizing domestic wielders of power. What this refers to is one of the core definitions of what is meant by a state that no doubt many of you are familiar with from your first and second year courses in international politics and political science that was articulated by Max Weber. And one of the characteristics of states that Max Weber emphasized above all else is that a state is an entity that monopolizes within a given territory the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence. That monopolizes within a given territory the use of force, coercion, and violence. Meaning that only those that are authorized by the state are able to engage in coercion and violence against its citizens. Eliminating external threats to the power of a wielder of force involves making war against neighbors and expanding your territory. But state making requires that one also, or that the leader also has to be able to keep his eye on domestic forces and make sure that there's no domestic wielder of power able to challenge it. The third function is extraction. Extraction refers to developing the means of extracting the resources necessary in order to play these 2 previous functions. The final function that I'll use is protection. And protection he defines as eliminating or neutralizing the competitors of the clients of the state. Probably one of the better ways of explaining that is with reference to protectionism. Protectionism is essentially the means by which a state authority protects the domestic producers of a particular product from foreign competition. That might otherwise undermine their ability to make profits. Now, these are not related to each other in a linear manner, but rather, and if you read the article, you notice in the little graph where he puts them in 4 corners with various arrows pointing to each other, suggesting that they're interrelated with one another. That these processes of war-making, state-making, extraction, and protection are ongoing in the development of states throughout the history of the development of those states. And he furthermore argues that to a large extent we can understand the differences between various states in the international system on the basis of looking at their history and how they were affected by these various processes. So, for example, just as an illustration, we'll look at all of this in much more detail as we move forward into our various case studies. In Germany, building, or in the case of Frederick William in Prussia, building a functioning state had very different requirements than it did, for example, in Great Britain. The main reason is that Prussia is surrounded by other states, by other political entities, and has extensive land borders. And consequently, defending the territory, the war-making component requires raising an enormous army in order to protect your territory from competitors on your borders. Great Britain, by contrast, certainly still had to defend itself on occasion against the invasions, but it was rather exceptional in that regard. It had not had its territory invaded since the Norman invasions more than 500 years ago. It enjoys a considerable amount of natural protection, and consequently, its state will have developed somewhat differently. One component of that is that, as is somewhat suggested by this contract model within Britain, is that the greatest threat of instability within Great Britain was not external invasion, but rather was domestic in nature, civil war. And consequently, a great deal more emphasis was put on various forms of distributive justice within Great Britain in order to prevent that kind of uprising among Scots or among the Irish or among the Welsh and so on and so forth. The fact that Great Britain did not have to raise a huge landing army in order to defend its territory and consolidate its state, in turn allowed Great Britain to focus on expanding its navy in order to offer greater protection and opportunities to its entrepreneurs. And that in turn allowed Great Britain to have a far greater role in colonizing other parts of the world and so on and so forth when compared to its German counterpart. In that regard, you can see that that states develop under very different circumstances, and while they all have to deal with these four different requirements, the context within which they carry these out are likely to be very different, in part at least because of the geography that is involved. The United States in this regard is also rather exceptional in that its institutions, for the most part, for the first 200 or 150 years of its history, enjoyed relatively free security from external threats. For reasons that we'll discuss in a couple of classes. And consequently also could avoid having to maintain a permanent military and large landed army and so on and so forth, and put their efforts elsewhere. The important thing to consider in this regard, and one point that Charles Tilly makes, is that Marxists tend to be rather simplistic in their understanding of the relationship between states and capitalists in coming to the conclusion that states are the tools of the capitalist class or under the control of capitalism, in large part because one of the things that he noted is that the rise of states like Brandenburg Prussia predated the creation of capitalist enterprises. And indeed, it was these states that recognized that the states that provided the economic space for the development of industries were able to wield greater force than those that did not. In other words, those that industrialized and allowed for the development of capitalist industries, like Great Britain and later France, ultimately became more powerful militarily. And that in that sense, it is these institutions, like corporations, were cultivated by states for their own interests. Corporations are the tools of states, not the other way around. Again, I'm not suggesting that you swallow that argument wholeheartedly. I think that there's a great deal to it, and there's a great deal that we can learn from these realist perceptions of the rise of states. But it does provide us with interesting propositions in terms of trying to analyze the foreign policies of different states. Liberal pluralists argue primarily for a liberal international order, rules-based international order, as being the best move forward in terms of creating a more stable and peaceful international environment. That understanding of free trade and globalization and international institutions as a basis for humanity moving forward rests on this understanding of the state. The state is a dependent variable, and its behavior depends on the interests of its population. And if the interests of that population are more and more tied to a regime of free trade that advances their standard of living, that allows them to access markets in other parts of the planet, and so on and so forth. The interests that hold states apart will start to disappear. And increasingly, free trade will win over, and sovereignty will simply disappear. States will ultimately become part of a global order that's based on a global division of labor and so on and so forth, and war will become a part of a thing of the past. Is that likely to happen in accordance with realists? In essence, what that suggests is that it's democracy that's in the driving seat. Realists will argue it's always the state. It's always the state. States are rational actors, and above all else, are committed to their own survival, to their own security. And the only means of guaranteeing that survival is to look at every other state with considerable amount of suspicion as to what their intentions are, and to amass as much power as possible. As much power understood primarily in military terms, and secondarily in economic terms, since economic resources are necessary to produce military power. And that this logic, according to realists, trumps the logic of capitalism and trumps the logic of democracy. And one way that we can kind of put this all into some perspective that allows us to walk away from this lecture with something to think about and some way of making sense of this, is that part of this liberal pluralist project, as embodied by the Clinton administration and by the Obama administration, was the U.S. attitude toward China. China had a communist system, anathema to the United States, and one that the United States has fought a Cold War to prevent from taking over the rest of the world. And yet, in the closing days of the Cold War, somehow the United States decided, hey, let's make friends with China. They're communists, that's okay. We'll open up our markets to their goods, we'll encourage our producers to invest in China, and everything will be wonderful. How the heck did they do that? Well, the assumption was that trade between China and the United States would ultimately make conflict between China and the United States less and less likely, because both sides would benefit from this relationship that they have with each other. And furthermore, that development within China, industrial development, would make the communist system impossible. That as people got better educated, got more wealthy, they would reject communism. That would be the end of communism, and then China would join the Western world, and we could all sing Kumbaya and live in harmony from that point on. Would the American public accept that? Yes, they would, because they reap enormous benefits from it. Would American capitalists benefit or accept it? Of course they would, because they make huge profits in China, and China makes huge profits in the United States. So why would the United States suddenly impose tariffs and sanctions and things along those lines on China? It makes no sense. It makes sense only if you believe that this is some bizarre fantasy of Donald Trump's that is unrelated to statecraft. Realists would have no problem making sense of this. Realists would argue that free trade was always a means of transforming China, but once it became evident that China wasn't going to be transformed by free trade, that the United States would, regardless of what economic interests might indicate, want to contain China's influence. And in that sense, would want to throw various obstacles in the way of Chinese economic growth, including imposing things like tariffs and so on and so forth, cut them off from their various resources and so on. And it's interesting to look at the international environment from that perspective. One of the things that we've noticed of late is the rising tensions in the Persian Gulf with regard to Iran. Now, why would the United States be picking up a fight over little Iran? Does Iran really pose a threat to the United States? Perhaps, in some abstract way, it poses a threat to Saudi Arabia or Israel, but even that is somewhat questionable. It certainly doesn't pose a major threat to the United States. So why pick a fight with Iran? And why pick a fight when it's very obvious that the only move that Iran can make in order to defend itself against an American attack is to shut down the Straits of Hormuz? Why would the United States do that? China gets 80% of its oil from Iran through the Straits of Hormuz. So you shut down the Straits of Hormuz, the first person to be crying foul would be China, not the United States, not anyone else. And in that sense, these policies indicate, once again, that logic of states and the balance of power between states is the driving force behind policy, as realists would have it, not the economic interests of Apple or Microsoft or the various number of investors that have important economic stakes in the relationship between China and the United States. Well, I hope that gives you something to think about for the next little while. And I promise that at this point, we're going to have only one other brief detour into theoretical discussions, and that is around the issue of hegemony in the current international system, which we will take on next week, and then go into our case studies beginning with the United States. So thank you for your attention, and we'll see you all next week.
Bro, did you come last week?
Huh?
Did you come last week?
Yeah.
Did he also do it without PowerPoint?
Yeah, he did. I'll give you the notes if you want.
I don't think you need to. Oh, okay. I don't know. I'm sure I just don't know if he's gonna ever.
No, he's not. Sorry.